Ladies and gentlemen, I am Joyce Meyer, and I want you to enjoy your life and become who God created you to be. If you truly want a positive change in your life, don't just listen, take action. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you can receive more inspiring messages. I am so excited to be here with you today because I believe that God has something powerful to say about trusting Him completely. You know, life can be unpredictable. Things don't always go as planned, and sometimes we feel like we're walking in the dark. But let me tell you something, God is always in control, even when we don't understand what's happening. Trusting God is not something we do only when life is easy or when things are going our way. It's a choice we make daily, regardless of our circumstances. Many people wait until they feel like trusting God before they actually do. But feelings are unpredictable. They change based on our mood, our environment, or what's happening around us. If we rely on feelings, we will always be on an emotional roller coaster, trusting God one moment and doubting Him the next. Real trust is not based on emotion. It is based on a firm decision to believe that God is who He says He is, and that He will do what He has promised. One of the biggest obstacles to trust is our own understanding. As human beings, we want to make sense of everything. We analyze, overthink, and try to figure out every detail of our lives. But the Bible tells us in Proverbs 3:05, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. That means trusting God requires us to let go of our need to control and understand everything. We don't have to know how God will work things out. We just need to know that He will. Sometimes trusting God feels difficult because we have been disappointed in the past. Maybe we've prayed for something and it didn't happen the way we expected. Maybe we've faced betrayal, loss, or struggles that made us question whether God was really working in our lives. But trust means choosing to believe in God's faithfulness, even when circumstances seem to say otherwise. It's not about ignoring reality. It's about believing that God is greater than what we see. He has a plan even when we don't understand it, and He is working behind the scenes for our good. Trusting God also means surrendering our worries and fears to Him. When we try to handle everything on our own, we carry a weight that we were never meant to bear. Fear and trust cannot coexist. When we are filled with fear, we are not truly trusting God. And when we trust Him, fear loses its grip. God doesn't ask us to figure everything out. He asks us to trust Him with everything. A great example of trust in the Bible is Abraham. God told him to leave his homeland and go to a place he had never seen. Abraham didn't have all the details, but he chose to trust God's guidance. Later, when God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac, Abraham still chose to believe that God would provide. His trust wasn't based on what he felt. It was based on knowing that God is faithful. That same kind of trust is what we are called to have today. Every day we have the opportunity to either trust God or rely on ourselves. The more we choose to trust Him, the stronger our faith becomes. It's not about having perfect faith. It's about making the decision again and again to place our confidence in Him rather than in our circumstances. Waiting on God's timing can be one of the hardest things to do, especially when we feel like nothing is happening. We live in a world where everything is fast-paced, instant answers, instant results, and immediate gratification. But God does not operate on our timeline. He is not bound by human schedules, and His ways are higher than our ways. While we may feel like we are waiting endlessly, God is never late. He is always working behind the scenes, even when we cannot see it. One of the biggest struggles people face is the feeling that God is taking too long. When we pray and don't see immediate answers, doubt begins to creep in. We wonder if God has forgotten about us or if He is ignoring our needs. But the truth is, God is never ignoring us. He is preparing us. Sometimes He delays certain things because He knows we are not ready for them yet. What we think is a denial is often just a delay for our own good. If God were to give us everything we asked for exactly when we wanted it, we might not be able to handle it. His timing is designed to protect us, strengthen us, and lead us into His perfect plan. In the Bible, there are many examples of people who had to wait on God's timing. Joseph had a dream that he would one day be a leader, but before that happened, he was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison For years, it seemed like his dream would never come true, but God was working behind the scenes, shaping his character and positioning him for his destiny. When the time was right, Joseph was elevated to a position of great authority, and everything God had promised came to pass. If Joseph had given up during the waiting period, he would have missed the blessing that God had for him. Another example is Sarah and Abraham, who were promised a child in their old age. But instead of waiting on God's perfect timing, Sarah took matters into her own hands and convinced Abraham to have a child with her servant Hagar. That decision brought unnecessary complications because it was not part of God's plan. When we try to rush God's timing, we often create problems that could have been avoided. But when we trust Him fully, we experience His best. God's timing is also a test of faith. When we wait, we learn to depend on Him more than on our own plans. It teaches us patience, builds our trust, and deepens our relationship with Him. Isaiah 40:31 says, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength." There is a special kind of strength that comes when we choose to wait on God rather than rushing ahead. Even when we don't understand why things are taking so long, we can trust that His timing is leading us to something far greater than we could have imagined. Fear is one of the greatest enemies of faith. It creeps in subtly, whispering doubts and worst-case scenarios, making us question if God will really come through. Faith, on the other hand, stands firm in the promises of God, even when circumstances seem uncertain. The two cannot coexist in the same heart at the same time. When fear takes over, faith weakens. But when faith is strong, fear loses its power. Choosing faith means making a conscious decision to trust God even when everything around us is screaming fear. Fear is a natural human response to uncertainty, but God has not called us to live in fear. The Bible repeatedly tells us, do not fear, because God knows how easily fear can take hold of our hearts. Fear keeps people from stepping into their God-given purpose. It causes hesitation, insecurity, and doubt. It makes us focus on our weaknesses instead of God's strength. Fear paralyzes, but faith moves forward. Faith believes in what cannot be seen, trusting that God is in control even when the path ahead is unclear. One of the most powerful examples of faith overcoming fear is found in the story of Peter walking on water. When Jesus called Peter to step out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water toward him. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the wind and waves, fear took over and he began to sink. That's exactly how fear works. It distracts us from God and magnifies the obstacle. As long as Peter kept his focus on Jesus, he was able to do the impossible. But when fear took control, he began to fall. This story is a reminder that faith requires us to keep our eyes on God rather than our circumstance. Fear often comes from focusing on what could go wrong instead of remembering who God is. When we face difficulties, the enemy tries to fill our minds with lies, making us doubt God's power, love, and faithfulness. But God has already given us everything we need to overcome fear. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." This means fear does not come from God. It is an attack meant to keep us from experiencing the fullness of what He has planned for us. But when we stand in faith, we activate the power of God in our lives. Faith does not mean we will never feel afraid, but it does mean we won't let fear control us. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move forward despite it. Faith reminds us that God is bigger than any problem, stronger than any obstacle, and always working on our behalf. When fear tries to rise up, we must remind ourselves of God's promises, speak His word, and trust that He is leading us in the right direction. Faith and fear cannot live together. One will always overpower the other. It is up to us to choose which one will rule our hearts. Life often brings moments where it feels like nothing is happening, as if our prayers are unanswered and our efforts are in vain. It's in these times that doubt begins to creep in, making us wonder if God has forgotten about us. But just because we can't see anything changing doesn't mean that God isn't working. He operates behind the scenes, orchestrating events, aligning people, and preparing circumstances in ways that we cannot yet understand. His silence does not mean inactivity. He is always at work. even when it's not visible to us. A powerful example of God working behind the scenes is found in the story of Esther. When Esther was taken to the palace, she had no idea that God was positioning her for a purpose greater than she could have imagined. There were no obvious miracles, no parting of the sea or burning bush, yet God's hand was evident throughout her journey. She was placed in the right position at the right time to save her people from destruction. Even though God's name is not directly mentioned in the book of Esther, His presence is undeniable. This reminds us that even when we don't see clear signs, God is still moving in the background of our lives. Many times delays and disappointments make it seem like God is distant, but what we see as a delay is often God's way of setting things up for a greater purpose. Joseph's life is another example of this. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and imprisoned for years. It would have been easy for Joseph to believe that God had abandoned him, but every painful experience was actually preparing him for his ultimate call. When the time was right, he was promoted to a position of great authority where he was able to save many lives, including his own family. Looking back, it was clear that God was working all along, even when Joseph couldn't see it. God's ways are not our ways. Sometimes He allows us to go through difficult seasons because He is strengthening our faith and building our character. He knows what lies ahead, and He is always preparing us for something greater. Even when things seem to be falling apart, they are often falling into place according to His divine plan. Romans 8:28 reminds us that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. This means that nothing is wasted. Every trial, every setback, and every waiting season has a purpose. Trusting that God is working behind the scenes requires faith. It means believing that He is making a way even when we don't see one. It means surrendering our plans and timelines to Him, knowing that He sees the bigger picture. No matter what we are facing, we can rest in the assurance that God is in control. He is working things out for our good, and in His perfect timing, everything will come together just as He planned. Trusting God is the key to experiencing true peace. Life is full of uncertainties, challenges, and unexpected twists. And if we try to handle everything on our own, we will find ourselves stressed, anxious, and overwhelmed. But when we choose to trust God completely, we no longer have to carry the weight of our worries. Trust allows us to rest in the assurance that God is in control even when life feels chaotic. It shifts our focus from our problems to His promises, replacing fear with faith and anxiety with peace. Many people struggle with worry because they feel the need to control every aspect of their lives. The truth is, no matter how much we try, we can never fully control what happens. Unexpected challenges arise, plans fall apart, and disappointments come. But God never intended for us to carry the burdens of life alone. Philippians 4:6 or 7 reminds us, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This verse teaches that when we bring our concerns to God, He exchanges our worry for His peace. One of the biggest reasons people lack peace is because they rely too much on their own understanding. They try to figure out every detail of their lives, overanalyzing situations, and constantly worrying about the future. But Proverbs 3:5 and 6 tells us to trust in the Lord with all our hearts and lean not on our own understanding. When we trust God fully, we acknowledge that His ways are higher than ours and His plans are greater than anything we could come up with on our own. This trust allows us to release control and rest in the knowledge that He is guiding our steps. Jesus demonstrated this kind of peace when He was asleep in the boat during a storm. The disciples were terrified, but Jesus remained at rest because He trusted the Father completely. His peace was not based on the absence of the storm, but on the presence of God. That same peace is available to us when we choose to trust Him. Storms will come, but when we know that God is with us, we don't have to be shaken. Trusting God also means surrendering our timelines. Many people struggle with restlessness because they want answers and solutions immediately. They feel anxious when things don't happen as quickly as they expected. But peace comes when we understand that God's timing is always perfect. Instead of rushing and worrying, we can wait with confidence, knowing that He is working things out in the best way possible. Peace is not something we achieve by trying harder. It is something we receive by trusting deeper. When we let go of our fears, surrender our plans, and fully place our trust in God, His peace fills our hearts and minds. No matter what happens, we can stand firm knowing that He is in control and His plans are always good.